Great. Yeah, thanks for all coming today. It is the last week of semester. So it's our last TESS seminar till actually the end of July when SP2 starts. But anyway, so today we're going out with a bang. We are welcoming Dr. Lyanne Brouwer. Lyanne is a relatively new JCU staff member. She came back to Australia about 6 months ago. She's in our zoology and ecology academic group. And she's got a interesting academic history. She has received her PhD in the Netherlands, and then came to Australia. She was at ANU, got a DECRA, developed some interesting research projects, ended up going back to the Netherlands, and now we're lucky to have her back here. And Yoko's on it. I guess we started the semester with these craziness, and we're gonna have a little bit. Anyway, without taking up any more time, we'll hand it over to Lyanne.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie. Yeah, so much of my research focuses on social behavior, mainly in birds, but I've also done some work in fishes. And I try to use long-term data sets of wild populations where I use a multidisciplinary approach, combining tools from the fields of evolutionary and behavior ecology, population genetics, population demography, and how this affects the patterns at the population level. And that ultimately helps, hopefully helps in conservation of species. Most recently, I've also studied how urbanization affects bird populations, but today I'll mainly focus on social behavior. So cooperation of animals is widespread, and it occurs among all levels of organization. So among individuals of the same but also different species. And why would individuals help each other? So of course, one can cooperate with anyone else, but such behavior can only evolve when you derive some benefits. And such benefits are more easy to derive from relatives, because by helping relatives, you can indirectly pass on your genes to the next generation. And we call this kin selection. So costly behavior is selected for when your relatives benefit. Now, this idea has helped explain the existence of so-called cooperative breeders. And these cooperative breeders are extremely social animals. And what they do is they delay their own reproduction to help their parents with raising their parents' offspring. So this behavior is quite common. It occurs in fish, insects, mammals, and birds. And what typically happens is that there is a dominant breeding pair, and they're young, they stay with their parents, and they help take care of the next brood. And we call these older, young, we call them subordinate helpers because they help. Now, this behavior is facilitated through limited dispersal. And the reason for this is that when dispersal is limited, there will be clusters of relatives. So individuals will be able to help relatives and indirectly pass on their genes to the next generation. So this is in stark contrast to when there is dispersal, because the movement will result in spatial separation of related individuals. And this is actually thought to be the main mechanism of inbreeding avoidance. So mating with relatives. So that means when dispersal is limited, closely related individuals are actually competing for space and mating opportunities. And that potentially can result in high risk of inbreeding, for example. And this has, of course, important implications for the persistence of populations. And during my PhD, I investigated how cooperation and competition at the individual level affect the patterns at the population level. So my study system was the cooperatively breeding Seychelles warbler. And this species occurs just on a few islands in the Indian Ocean. So I spent about 4 months per year on this uninhabited island. Once a week, we could go get some rice and lentils and drinking water, and that was about it. So it's a tiny island. You can walk around it in about half an hour. And these birds just live their life there. The offspring stay with their parents. They help feeding the offspring. And we actually found some interesting other cooperative behaviors. So a large part of this island is covered in Bisonia grandis. And while this tree is native to the area, it has a very specific way of dispersing its seeds. So the seeds are very sticky and they have little hooks, so they stick to the birds. And when the birds then fly to different islands, the seeds disperse among the islands. However, sometimes these birds get entangled in these seeds, and that usually results in their death because they won't be able to get them off. And that's why this tree is also called the bird catcher tree. Now, we observed that these Seychelles warblers actually showed some very interesting behavior, and that is that they help remove seeds from group members. So they basically risk their own life to help group members get rid of these seeds. And we call this rescue behavior. So individuals risk their own life to help others. And this behavior is well known from primates and ants, but it was actually the first time that this was recorded in birds. Now, this behavior is quite rare, and it's not something you typically see. And a much more common and a much less risky behavior, actually, is help taking care of the next brood. So that's what these helpers typically do. So obviously, it will be costly because instead of foraging for yourself, you're feeding young that are not your own. But this extra feeding that these young get are likely to result in some benefits for these offspring. And indeed, it turns out, as you can see here, that offspring raised with helpers have a higher survival than those raised without helpers. And this does not only happen in their first year of life, as you can see here, the white points, but also when later on, when they're an adult. And what you can see in the second figure is that this is not the result of just living in a larger groups, because larger groups with individuals that didn't show this helping behavior actually did not affect this offspring survival. Now, this positive effects on survival could also be due to some other effects like maternal effects or some genetic effects. And to rule this out, we performed a cross-fostering experiment. So we raised young of groups of that were born in groups of with helpers, in groups without helpers, and vice versa. And it turns out that the offspring from territories with helpers that were raised without helpers did not actually survive better. So these positive effects are due to the helping behavior itself and not so much due to any genetic or maternal effects. So the conclusion is that, yes, these helpers do help. However, when they show this helping behavior, the group is likely increasing in size. And at some point, you will expect that there will be increased competition. And for this species, it's particularly important to find out how that works, because this species is actually endangered. So up to the 1990s, the whole population of Seychelles warblers was confined to this single island. So 320 birds were confined to the single island. And you can see the population numbers here. And then in the beginning of the 90s, as part of a conservation program, birds were translocated to new islands. Now, if you look at the original Cousin population, you can see there is some fluctuation in numbers. But it's really hard to study how individuals compete with each other, because higher population numbers usually indicate that the environment is very good as well. So usually the birds actually survive and reproduce better. But these translocations actually provide us with a great opportunity to study how increasing density results in increased competition among individuals without any confounding effects of the environment. So I studied how reproduction changed with increasing population density in these three populations. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, that with an increasing density, so an increasing number of birds per hectare, the number of fledglings that was produced decreased. And in addition, I found that the population with the highest bird density, so the one in red here, also had the highest food availability, measured as the insect density. And at the same time, competition for the decrease in reproduction was the slowest at this population. So this suggests that there is competition for food. And indeed, combining all these estimates in a population model confirmed that these populations are regulated through reproduction, through competition for food. And this helped us to identify some new suitable habitat for future translocations. And the result is that with another 2 translocations, the species has now been downgraded and is not threatened anymore. Now, the main problem of the limited dispersal in this species is the ability to colonize new islands. But even in mainland populations, there might be problems with limited dispersal. But typically, for most species, one of the sexes usually disperses further than the other. So that's the main inbreeding avoidance mechanism. For example, if you consider the Australian fairy wrens, in 9 out of 10 species, only the males delay their dispersal, and the females make a long-distance movement in search of a vacancy, after which they usually die because they can't find the vacancy. But there is one species, and that's the red-winged fairy wren, shown here. And there, both males and females delay their dispersal. Now, how does this species deal with the expected high risk of inbreeding? That's what I tried to study. So I set up a field-based study in Southwest WA and Smithbrook Nature Reserve. And so the area is sort of the tall tree forest of the Southwest with a very dense undergrowth where the birds live. And here you can see a territory map of the area. So each year we monitor these birds, so we follow them over their lives. And we know in each territory, who the breeders were, who the helpers were, how much they reproduce, where they move, and so on. Nest finding is an important part of this work because we want to measure reproductive success. And that means spending hours and hours in this dense undergrowth searching for these nests. So the predation rates are really high too. So about 80% of the nests get depredated, mainly by tiger snakes. So this nest finding is basically never ending, but yeah, great fun to do. And from all the birds in the study area, I take blood samples. And this allows me to genotype them using microsatellites and to look at the genetic parentage patterns and genetic clustering. So young birds typically stay with their parents to help rear the next brood, and then eventually they disperse to a breeding vacancy. And what you can see here is that all the suitable habitats, so all the forest area, is actually occupied by territories. And this saturation of the habitat has been proposed as the main driver for the evolvement of cooperative breeding. Because if there's no habitat to disperse to, you might as well stay home with your parents and help them. Now, a textbook example that provided evidence for this comes from the experimental creation of vacancies in the closely related superb fairy wren. So this species has male helpers only, and that's because all the females disperse when they're young, and they often die because they can't find any suitable habitat. And if the limitation of the habitat is really the driver of cooperative breeding, then you would expect that if you create a vacancy, then birds would move in and start breeding. So that's what was done in this experiment that was performed in Canberra. And the result was actually that when the breeding pair was removed, nothing happened. So males did not move in. However, when the original female was then released in the territory, they found that males immediately moved in. So the conclusion was that it's both the limitation of mates and habitat that drive cooperative breeding in these species. Now, I wondered if mates are not a limiting factor, what will happen? So I repeated this experiment in the red-winged fairy wren. So there's male and female helpers in abundance, high abundance. So I expected when I create this breeding vacancy, they should move in and start breeding. But to my surprise, these helpers did not want to disperse into these vacancies. And then in a similar approach as in the previous experiment, I released the original male or female into the territory. And then what happened was that within a few hours, a bird would move in. So why would these birds not disperse into suitable habitats when they have the chance to do so? Well, our idea is that the sudden disappearance of multiple group members actually indicate a high risk of predation, for example. Thereby, these results are consistent with the perceptual trap hypothesis. So the avoidance of habitats because cues do not accurately reflect their quality. Now, interestingly, these results can also explain the previous findings, which were actually widely interpreted as evidence for ecological constraints. But it also means that, that there might be important implications for conservation because any opportunities for colonization might go unexploited. So following these birds throughout their lives gave me a good idea about their dispersal distances. And what you can see here is the schematic overview of the study area that we checked for dispersers. So the light green area are all forest area connected through habitat corridors shown in dark green. And what I found is, as expected, dispersal is very limited, although females disperse slightly further than males, so females in pink. Still, males typically disperse only 50 meters, 1 or 2 territories. Females maybe 3. And what I also found is that dispersal through these corridors is actually less than you would expect based on the distribution of the observed dispersal distances. And the result is that within each area separated by these corridors, these individuals are genetically more similar than among those areas. And that was measured through calculating FST values. So there is genetic differentiation among these areas with the thickness of the arrows that indicates the strength of differentiation. And it's striking that even areas separated by corridors of like about 100 to 150 meters, there's already genetic differentiation. So that means that habitat fragmentation might have dramatic consequences for social species like this with very limited dispersal distances. Now, these analyses were based on microsatellite data, and I'm currently working on SNPs, which are better suited to detect these spatial genetic clustering patterns. And that will hopefully give some insights in the characteristics of these habitat corridors, which corridors limit dispersal most. The question for now is, how does a species where dispersal is so limited, how does this species avoid mating with relatives? And to answer this, I looked at the genetic parentage of the offspring. And it turned out that 58% of the offspring is actually sired by a male other than the social male. So these females are highly promiscuous. And these males, they compete among each other by displaying their beautiful plumage. So they move to the female's territory, display their beautiful plumage, bring flowers, which is actually something they never do at home. And the question, of course, is how does this extra pair paternity behavior help, or does it actually help with inbreeding avoidance? It also turned out that, as expected, the limited dispersal results in a high percentage of social pairs that is closely related. So 17% of the social pairs is related at the level of half-SIP or higher. And if you look at the relatedness of the social pair and their proportion of extra pair young, you can see that there is a positive relation there. So more related social pairs have more extra pair offspring. So this suggests that yes, extra pair paternity might play a role in this inbreeding avoidance behavior. But what about inbreeding? Is it really a problem? And does it have any negative effects on fitness? So these are actually results from my MSc student, Wendy Lichtenauer. And what you can see here is the genetic relatedness of the pairwise relatedness of the genetic parents. Sorry. So the higher the pairwise R is, the more inbred an offspring is. And it's plotted against different fitness traits. And these results are actually very mixed. So first-year survival is reduced when you're more inbred, whereas adult survival, there's actually a positive relationship. Now, reproduction mainly decreased with increased inbreeding, but there doesn't seem to be a relationship with the probability of recruiting to a breeding position. So this inbreeding has mixed effects on fitness components. So what does it sort of mean for an overall measure of fitness? So to look at this, we sort of have to integrate all these measures. And if you think about fitness in its simplest form, it can be thought of as the number of gene copies an individual contributes to the next generation. So if you think about the contribution of an individual to the next year, it would be whether that individual survives plus half the number of offspring it produces. But in cooperative breeders like this red-winged fairy wren, the surviving offspring actually becomes a helper. And these helpers have a lower chance to reproduce compared to this breeder, for example. So we have to weigh these factors. And what we did is that we used reproductive values. And these reproductive values are the contribution of an individual of a given age, stage, or class to the long-term population growth rate. So for each individual, fitness is now weighed by the reproductive value of that individual, of that state and sex. Now you might wonder how we calculated these reproductive values, so I just quickly show you how we did that. So we first built a life cycle graph, as you can see here. This life cycle graph has three groups of individuals: fledglings, subordinate helpers, and dominant breeders. Now, a subordinate helper in any year could become a dominant breeder in the next year, provided it survives with the probability JS, multiplied with the probability of recruiting to a dominant position, MSD. Alternatively, it will remain a subordinate if it survives, JS, multiplied by the probability 1 minus MSD of not becoming a dominant, and so on. So we can write this in matrix form, and using matrix algebra, we can derive the reproductive value equations, and we can then resolve these using the parameter estimates from the long-term field data. So once we have these reproductive values, we calculated an integrated fitness measure for each individual. And what we then get is this integrated fitness measure plotted against the inbreeding coefficient, and that shows that there's a very strong reduction in fitness with inbreeding. And this reduction is about 75%. Now, what is the role of this extra pair mating in this story? Well, if you look at the left-hand side of the figure here, you can see the fitness of the offspring from unrelated social parents. So these offspring. And those boxes are split up in the within pair in black and the extra pair offspring. And what you can see here is that there is no difference in fitness between the within and the extra pair offspring. If you look at the offspring of related social parents, you can see that the within pair offspring, so the offspring of the pair male and female, has a very low fitness, especially compared to the offspring from the same female that mated with a male from another territory. So this shows that promiscuity definitely reduces these consequences of inbreeding. So to come back to my question, does extra pair paternity serve as an inbreeding avoidance mechanism? We could conclude, yes, this seems to be true. But also going back to some of the results that I showed you earlier, we found that 70% of the females actually engages in this behavior, but only 17% benefits. At the same time, about half of all the inbred offspring is actually the result of this extra pair mating. And this might not be surprising because all this extra pair mating going on, female offspring has no clue of who their genetic father is. So we've had cases where females actually disperse to pair up with a male, and that male turns out to be her genetic father. So while extra pair paternity can help avoid inbreeding, we don't think it's the main function of this behavior. Now, I wondered why would all these females still engage in this behavior? Because for males, it's obvious, they can increase their reproductive success. But why would females do this? And it turns out that this behavior is actually really common across species. So when I looked at the literature, I found that over 500 papers have published results on extra pair mating in birds. This includes over 300 bird species from all over the world. And you can see that there's enormous variation in the rates of this behavior. You can see the pattern here in this figure, which shows the frequency distribution of the number of species and the percentage of offspring that is extra pair. And what you can see that in some species it's actually quite rare, like here. In other species, the majority of females actually engages in this behavior. So I wanted to test whether there are broad-scale ecological drivers that explain this variation. And I was particularly interested in the amount of genetic structuring. And as a proxy, I used dispersal distance to test this. And at the same time, I used lots of other ecological variables that have all been suggested to play a role in this behavior. And although I found some interesting patterns within species, if you look at the variation among species, it turns out that none of these ecological variables can explain any of that variation. And the strongest pattern I found is that there is a strong phylogenetic signal. So most of the variation is among old clades of birds. And you can see that in this figure, where the blue bars indicate the levels of extra pair paternity. And you can see they are highly clustered within this phylogeny. So that means that if you're trying to explain this interspecific variation, that becomes extremely difficult, because if you're looking at the correlation with population density, for example, you might be comparing species which have very specific population densities and also very specific extra pair paternity rates. So that basically becomes impossible. So ideally, you should study this variation in closely related species. But as you can see here as well, closely related species typically show very little variation in this trait and in many other traits as well. However, there's one system, coming back to the Maluridae, the family of the grass Emiiverans, and this system is ideally suited to test this idea, because it's currently the best studied family with respect to genetic mating system. So I've initiated a large-scale collaboration with all the researchers studying the different species, and this resulted in a data set of over 10,000 genotyped offspring. And this not only allowed me to examine variation among individuals, but also over time and among populations and among species. So I'd quickly like to acknowledge my collaborators that have spent many, many years in the lab and field to collect all this data. Now, the main result is that in contrast to the previous work, where I found that variation among species mainly due to phylogeny, here, by studying these close related species, I found that over 80% of this variation in extra-pair paternity rates can actually be explained by ecological drivers. And I'll just show you one example of the inbreeding avoidance hypothesis. So you would expect that if extra-pair paternity has a function in inbreeding avoidance, that there would be a correlation between the proportion of incestuous pairing in a population and the extra-pair paternity rates. Now, this is not what I found, but, oops. But what I did find was that females paired incestuously, shown here, females paired incestuously, and years with many incestuous pairings are both positively correlated with extra-pair paternity rates. So there's definitely evidence for this hypothesis, but it might not always be easy to detect this pattern at all levels of variation. And it shows that why these broad-scale comparative studies have such difficulty in detecting these patterns. So studying close related species may help reveal some more of these patterns and make it clearer whether inbreeding avoidance can explain variation in this behavior. Okay, to quickly summarize, so I found that limited dispersal may facilitate cooperation, but it also leads to problems like the inability to occupy new islands, as in the case of the Seychelles warbler. It can result in genetic clustering. It can lead to inbreeding with significant reductions in fitness. And although extra-pair mating can sometimes help resolve some of these issues, habitat fragmentation, on the other hand, may aggravate these effects. So the question is, why do individuals cooperate? And I would like to show you some of my future plans. So if we look at the global distribution of cooperative breeders, you can see that this behavior is most common in Australia and tropical Africa. And it has been suggested that this must be caused by the harsh environmental conditions. So the idea is that pairs do not succeed to breed on their own without the assistance of extra individuals in many of the species. At the same time, this idea suggests that social behavior may actually buffer some of the impacts of climate change, for example. But a problem with testing this idea across the species is that a large proportion of the variation is explained by species sharing a common phylogenetic ancestor. So as we've seen before in the results on extra-pair mating, the same is true here. So cooperative breeding is more common in certain clades of birds, but these clades are actually overrepresented in certain areas, like Australia. At the same time, climate will also affect the social behavior itself. So there will be large variation among space and time in social behavior. And that means it cannot be seen as a trait of a certain species, but probably there's a lot more variation than we've realized. So far, these challenges have not really been addressed. And the main issue is that really adequate systems to test these ideas are very limited. So I plan to use a within genus comparative approach using the variant family. And I want to examine how this spatial temporal variation in social system is shaped by variability in climate. And we already have quite a bit of data here. So all the colored points here are data from existing populations that have been monitored. And in addition, I will try to collect more data along these transects. So along transects following a rainfall gradient, basically, as shown as in A and B here. And what I aim to do is also examine how helping behavior varies among these different species and populations. Now, we have also initiated a citizen science project, and that will hopefully help with some data collection as well. So this is a collaboration with the mobile app, eBirds, that some of you might know. And that allows members of the public to upload any observations on birds. And hopefully we'll get lots of observations on variants as well. So if you happen to observe any variants somewhere and find out more about the species and the group sizes, please go to our website. That would be really helpful. So in addition, I will also use my long-term field study on the rate-weight variance to investigate whether social behavior actually buffers the impacts of adverse conditions. So far studies have typically treated the social environment of species as a stable property, whereas you can expect that climate will actually affect social behavior because it will affect food availability, for example. And so I will determine how climate affects fitness directly, but also how it affects behavior and how the behavior then again can buffer the impacts of climate on fitness. So that will, for example, include following birds and making time budget to see whether birds are actually trading off their helping behavior against active cooling, for example. And experiments like cross-fostering and supplementary feeding will then help you to determine the causal links between all these aspects. So some previous work in collaboration with Janet Gardner from ANU has already suggested that this species is affected by adverse conditions. So in this study, we combined the data that I collected with some long-term data from a citizen science project, so a banding group that has been going out for about 30 years, banding birds in the forests of the Southwest. And we found that body mass is associated with extremes in both temperature and rainfall. So for example, cold, wet days on the day before measuring result in a much lower body mass. And high rainfall in the 30 days before measuring results in lower body mass. Whereas a higher minimum temperature in the 24 hours leading up to capture results in a positive association. And we also know that body mass is closely linked to survival, for example. So extreme weather likely has important ramifications for these populations. But we couldn't include any of the social behaviors in these analyses because they were all marked recapture data, so we couldn't tell what the birds were actually doing, whether they were helping or breeding or. So that's what I hope to do in the future. So understanding the role of social behavior and particularly the high diversity of social systems in Australia will be crucial to reliably predict how vulnerable species are to climate change, for example. So I'd like to end here and particularly thank all my field assistants and lab assistants and actually looking for people interested in doing a PhD on these ideas. So please contact me if you are interested or if you know someone who is interested. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions.